Chapter 8. Desire and Will in Fable. I herewith reproduce the fable of the mentative couple, a bit of writing in the lighter vein perpetrated by myself about a year ago. My excuse for writing this tale and for reproducing it now is that it carries with it a decided moral and teaches an important truth. It brings out the distinction existing between the motive and emotive phases of the mind. Beneath its flippancy is concealed some good, sound, psychological truth. I ask that you read it in connection with what I have just told you regarding the offices of the will, desire, imagination, etc. It will show you in figurative style the operation of the two poles of desire, will, and it will show you how the emotive pole or phase, if left unguarded by the protective faculties, will be led into all sorts of trouble. It will also show you how the protective faculty may be disarmed and overcome by a diversion of its attention from its task. There are several important psychological facts brought out in this little fable, and a number of important morals to be deduced therefrom. I trust that you will seek for the truth and principles underlying the trifling words of the fable, just as important truths may be conveyed in the fairy tales of the child, so may just as important facts be taught by the fairy tale fables of the mentative couple intended for grown-ups. Each of us, man or woman, has a mentative castle, in which dwells a mentative couple, Volos and Tioni. And Volos often strays away, leaving Tioni unprotected, and the fascinating stranger often puts in an appearance, and Tioni often is beguiled by his wiles, and Volos often is fooled by having his attention and interest distracted by clever schemes, leaving Tioni unprotected again. So, while recognizing the value of Tioni, learn to keep Volos at home at the gate of the castle, and do not allow him to be sidetracked. Heed the advice of the wise man of the fable. There is an important lesson for you in this fable if you will take the trouble to find it. The Fable of the Mentative Couple. Once upon a time there lived in the land of Mentalvania, in a wonderful building called the Mentative Castle, a man and a woman called the Mentative Couple. They were happy and married. They lived in harmony because they were useful to one another, and neither was complete without the presence of the other, and neither did his or her best work unless the other was present and assisting. Well, now the man was called Volos, which is the same as the English name Will, and the woman was called Tioni, which in the language of that country meant something like a combination of emotion, desire, and imagination. Now, the chronicle informs us that these two people had natures entirely different from each other. As has been said, we are told that Volos was the stern, inflexible, strong, positive nature, apt to stick to a thing once begun, full of the will to live and vitality, full of determination and spirit, with a strong dash of the let me alone and get out of my way in his makeup, with a taste for meeting difficulties and overcoming obstacles, with a goodly habit of reaching out and taking hold of what Tioni wanted and needed, and a powerful lot of self-respect and self-reliance in him. He was apt to be firm, although his firmness was not the stubbornness of a mule. His general keynote was strength. He was a good warrior and a defender of his castle. But Tioni was of an entirely different type. Temperament and character, she was most impressionable and imaginative, emotional, credulous, fanciful, full of desire, curious, sympathetic, and easily persuaded. While Volos was all willing and thinking, Tioni was all feeling. Volos was a strong character, but lacked certain qualities that makes for success. But these qualities Tione possessed, and she supplied the deficiency in Volos. Volos had to figure out everything, while Tione had intuition and jumped at a conclusion in a way remarkable to Volos, who couldn't understand the process at all. When he would ask Tione for an explanation, she would just say lightly, "Oh, just because," which answer would often provoke profane and irreverent discourse on the part of Volos. But, nevertheless, he learned to respect these becauses of Tione and found that they helped him in his business. Tione would dream out things and see things a long way ahead, and then Volos would proceed to put these plans into operation. Volos couldn't see very far ahead of his nose, while Tione could see miles beyond and years ahead, and besides this faculty of mental imagery that came in so useful in Volos' business, Tione also possessed a burning and ardent desire for things, which she managed to communicate to Volos, thereby causing him to get out and do things that otherwise he would never have dreamed of doing. Tione was like fire, and Volos like water. The water would hold the fire in check, but at the same time the fire would heat up the water, and the result would be steam of action. And so, you see, these two, this mentative couple, formed a fine co-partnership and prospered mightily. But, alas, the tempter entered Eden, and the attractive stranger meandered into the direction of the meditative castle, and when he reached there, trouble occurred. And this is what happened. One day Volos was absent from the castle, being engaged in some arduous enterprise, and consequently the castle was unguarded. Volos had provided against this by instructing Tione that she was to keep the castle gate closed tight when he was away from home, and never to gaze without in his absence, for there was some mysterious danger lurking without when he was away. Tione had faithfully followed the directions of her liege lord, although her womanly curiosity was piqued. Many the time she had heard strange knockings at the castle gate, but she heeded them not, and even refrained from looking out of the little peephole at the gate, though this last was much against her inclination, for she could see no harm in just looking. But to return to our tale. This particular day, when Volos was absent from home, her curiosity was too much for Tione, when she heard the strange knockings at the gate, and breaking her rule, she ventured to peep without. Looking down, she saw a most attractive stranger with a fascinating smile on his lips. He looked almost as strong as Volos, but he seemed to have a dash of the woman in him. Besides, he had the strength but also the charm that Tione recognized as being a part of her own nature. "Ah," sighed Tione, "here is a man who can understand me." The fascinating stranger smiled sweetly, and looking her in the eyes, masterfully asked to be admitted. "No, no," replied Tione. "I cannot let you in, for Volos told me not to." "Ah, fair lady," said the stranger softly, "Volos means all right, but he's rather old and foggish, and behind the times. He does not understand, as do you and I. Pray, let me in." And like Mother Eve, Tione took the bait. Well, to make a long story short, when Volos came home, he found that Tione had subscribed to a set of Villevo Modern Art, a beautiful work published by the Deluxe Brothers of Fifth Avenue, to be issued in 824 weekly parts at the nominal price of $5 a part, 739 parts of which were already out and would be delivered shortly. She had also given a number of side orders for manifold wares, which had dazzled her untrained and unguarded fancy. Volos cried aloud to the gods of his land, but it was too late. The contracts had been signed. But this was just the beginning. Volos did not understand just what was the matter, and contented himself with scolding Tione, whereat she wept bitterly. But the poison went on with its deadly work, and when Volos again was absent from home, the habit reasserted itself, and when the fascinating stranger again called at the castle, he was admitted. And when Volos returned, he found the castle furnished from dungeon to watchtower with costly rugs and furniture, and various other articles brought from Morgenstern's popular installment house at $1,000 down and $100 per week. He also found that the castle had been lightning rodded from ground to turret on each wing, tower, and annex, and that sundry promissory notes containing a law-proof judgment confessed clause had been given in exchange therefor. And then Volos swore by the beard of Mars, the war god, that he would have no more of this. He would remain at home thereafter, and he did. But the subtle stranger was on to the game in all of its details, and this is how he played it on Volos, even though the latter remained at home. A few days after Volos had determined to remain at home, there came a band of mountebanks, singing, dancing, and performing juggling tricks. Volos sat on the great stone beside the open castle gate, and his attention was attracted by the sounds and sights. Faster the dance twirled, louder beat the drum, sweeter grew the singing, more bewildering grew the feats of jugglery, until poor Volos forgot all about the open castle gate. So rapt was he at the strange sights, sounds, dances, and feats of jugglery. Then one of the mountebank gang, who was really the attractive stranger disguised in motley array, slipped unseen past Volos, and in a moment was engaged in eager conversation with the impressionable Tione. Volos watched the crowd until it moved away, and then entering the castle and closing the gate behind him, was confronted by Tione in tears, for she dreaded the coming storm. "Alack a day! Woe is me!" she cried. "I am again in trouble. Oh, Volos, my liege lord, I have just ordered from the fascinating stranger who slipped past you at the gate a baby grand self-playing automatic liquid air valve radium carburetor piano playing organet, upon which I may play for you all classes of music, from Wagner's Götterdämmerung to the popular Merryweather Waltz, with feeling, depth of expression, and soulful understanding, according to the words of the fascinating stranger who took my order." "Gazooks," says Volos, "fain would I cry aloud the name of that production of Wagner's just mentioned by thee, and by my Helidom, e'en shalt thou soon be performing the waltz just mentioned by the false red lips. Zounds, of a truth, I've been stung again by that fascinating stranger. I must gaze no more upon these fleeting scenes of merriment and amazement, lest I be again decorated with the ass's ears. Ah, Volos is himself again, and the next time the fascinating stranger appears upon the scene, he shall be smitten hip and thigh with my trusty battle-axe, and my snickersee shall pierce his foul carcass." But alas, once more was poor Volos deceived and trifled with, once more poor Tione fascinated by the stranger, and it came about in this way. One day of his last undoing, Volos sat on the open step, in front of the narrowly opened castle door. "No man shall pass me now," cried he. But fate willed otherwise, for as he sat there approached many people who took seat upon the steps before the gate, and engaged Volos in a long-heated and wearisome discourses regarding the outlook for the crops. The presidential campaign, the Japanese question, race suicide, the new theology, how old was Anne, the problem of the final outcome of the collision between the irresistible force and the immovable body, the canals of Mars, what Roosevelt will do with his big stick when his term expires, and many other weighty, interesting, and fascinating topics of general interest. Most agreeable were these visitors, and most considerate of Voller's feelings were they. And although they seemed to differ from him at the beginning of each argument, still they courteously allowed him to convince them inch by inch, until they finally acknowledged that he was invincible in argument and invulnerable in logic. "'Tis passing strange," quoth Wallace, "but nevertheless 'tis true, that I always find myself on the right side of every question, and the wonder grows when they all admit it in the end. Verily, am I developing into a wise guy." And, pondering thus, he felt sweetly asleep from the rigor of the disputes. The flattering attention shown him, the joy of the victory, and the exceeding amount of attention and interest he had expended. For human nature has its limitation, even in the case of one so strong as Volos, and while he slumbered, the fascinating stranger, who was really the leader of the argumentative visiting committee, crept into the house and unloaded upon Tioni a choice collection of gilt-edged mining stock, pure gilt all the way through, in fact, a bunch of flying machine bonds, and a monkey-powered automobile called the Yellow Peril. And when Volos discovered what had happened, he wept aloud, crying bitterly, "Odds bones, there's death, of a sort am I, the Baron easy mark." And thereupon he set for the wise man who dwelt in the next barony. The wise man came, and after hearing the story said, "My children, yours is a sad case. The trouble is as follows. Volos without Tioni has no desire or incentive to do things. He has no wants to satisfy, and therefore does nothing. He needs Tioni to supply the desire, and without her he has no feeling. He is nothing but a hard-shell clam. Therefore he needs her to supply the feeling. For verily, and of the truth, feeling is the spice of life, and without her he has no imagination, and cannot see beyond the end of his nose. And what is life without imagination? And on the other hand, Tioni without Volos is a consuming fire of desire, an unrestrained imagination, an intuitive faculty, degenerated into the basest superstition, most deplorable credulity, and the idlest fancy. Volos has no desire, emotion, or imagination of his own, and Tioni has no will of her own. Everyone can see that this couple needs one another. Each alone is but an incomplete half. United they stand, divided they fall. In union alone is their strength for them. And more than this, each without the other falls a prey to the wiles of some fascinating stranger. We have seen how Tioni was fascinated and controlled by the stranger who gained access to the castle, but I have also seen, by my magic art, that when Volos was away from home and on important business, and not having Tioni along to keep him straight, he fell a victim to the wiles of the desire and imagination of a fair stranger across the river, and did her bidding, and used his will to perform her tasks, instead of those desired by his own, Tioni. And this is the secret of the undoing of Tioni. Without the will of Volos to protect her, direct her, and advise her, Tioni allowed her desire, imagination, and emotion to run wild, and unrestrained. And so she became so impressionable as to allow herself to be mastered by the will of the stranger, who took advantage of the same and gathered to himself many choice orders for things. And even when Volos sat by the door watching the players, dancers and jugglers, his attention was so centered on what he saw that the fascinating stranger slipped through the gate. It was even as if Volos had been absent from home. And again, when Volos allowed himself to become engaged in weighty discourse with the visiting committee, and used up his energy and force in argument and dispute with them, and when he permitted himself to be jollied into a false security by this united brethren of the Blarney Stone, he relaxed his vigilance and allowed himself to become tired, drowsy, and sleepy, and so fell into a doze at his post, and the stranger again entered and took Tioni's orders for goods. And this, then, is the remedy, as my successor Lawson of Boston will say in the centuries to follow. This is the remedy. Each person of his mentative couple must stick close to the other. Volos must have no important business across the river, which will allow Tioni to be without a protector and adviser. And Tioni must stick close to Volos and satisfy her curiosity, imagination, emotion, and desire by setting him to work out things for her, to do things dreamed of by her, to get her things she desires, to express the things felt by her. This is the secret of success, dear mentative couple. Mutual work by desire and will, working in unison and harmony, each faithful to each other, each guarding the other from the fascinating strangers that beset each when separated. Now then, children, stick close to each other. And saying this, the wise man vanished from sight. And the moral of this fable of the mentative couple is this, that the mind of every man and woman is a mentative castle, wherein dwells a Volos and an Tioni. And what happened to the couple in the fable may happen, and does happen, to many in everyday life. The will, straying from home and paying attention to other attraction, leaves the castle unguarded, and the fascinating stranger enters. And again the will has its attention distracted by passing objects of interest and forgets the castle door. And again the will allows itself to be fatigued, tired, and jollied by useless argument and talk and cogitation, at the instigation of the designing, fascinating stranger, and the latter slips past the gate. And in each case, inside the gate is Tioni, unprotected and innocent, true to her own nature, credulous, imaginative, fanciful, desireful, and emotional. Is it any wonder that she orders goods that are not wanted by the family? And the remedy of the wise man has given to the mentative couple may be and should be applied by every man and woman in his or her mental castle. And this then is the moral of the fable. And thus endeth the fable of the mentative couple who dwell in the mentative castle in Mentalvania, in the days of old, when brave knights held their sway and fair ladies had their way. The end of the fable of the mentative couple. Chapter 9, Mind Power in Action. And now let us consider the subject of the operation of mind power in the phase of its employment, consciously or unconsciously, to affect the minds of others. It is true that this subject will be considered in details in the chapter on personal magnetism and telementation, but it will be well for us to take a glance at the general workings at this point. I shall cover the points briefly, the elaboration being made at the proper points in the lessons. In the first place, let us consider the matter of mentative induction. As you have seen, the currents of mind power flow in vibratory waves from the mind of the individual and act upon the minds of others according to the laws of mentative induction. They thus set up corresponding vibrations and therefore corresponding mental states of feelings in the minds of such people. In other words, these vibrations induce or set up by induction in the minds of others mental states similar to those existing in the minds of the mentator. This induced mental states are similar in quality and nature to those in the original mind. But of course, they are less in degree, for a part of the original energy has been dissipated in many directions, and then again a certain amount of force is lost according to the degree of resistance in the receiving mind. If the receiving mind sets up consciously or unconsciously a considerable resistance to the vibration, it will either entirely neutralize or repel them, or else rob them of much of their power. If, on the contrary, the receiving mind be in its nature more or less in accord with the vibrations, it will set up little or no resistance, and the induced condition will be very nearly as strong as the original impulse. The ether, or fine substance filling space, is constantly filled with these mentative currents of all kinds and degrees, streaming out from the minds of all kinds of people. These currents, of course, come in contact with each other and often either combine or else act to neutralize each other. For instance, currents of a certain degree or kind of vibration, that is, of a certain mental state, when they come in contact with other currents of similar vibration, will tend to coalesce and combine, there being a harmony and attraction existing between them. But if they are opposing vibration, they will antagonize each other and act in the direction of neutralizing each other's force. If they are of equal strength, both will lose power. But if one is much stronger than the other, it will lose only in the inverse ratio of its strength, and the weaker will suffer likewise. That is, the weaker will lose twice as much power as the stronger, and the stronger will lose only half as much as the weaker, supposing that the stronger is of twice the strength of the weaker. In this way is accounted for the well-known fact that places, towns, cities, etc., have their own personal atmospheres, which affect persons living in them or visiting them. These personal atmospheres of towns arise from a combining, neutralizing, etc. of the various vibrations arising from mentative currents from the minds of the people living in the town. An average vibration is struck, which is strongly felt by all within the field of induction of that town. A little thought will make it clear to you that this is a correct statement of the mental conditions manifest in various towns, cities, etc. all over the world. Each place has its own individuality, which soon makes its impression on those taking up their abode in it. It is more than geographical and atmospheric conditions, although, of course, these play their parts, as we all know. The average mental state of the people living in the town strikes the key note. The stronger vibrations affect the average and give a mental tone to the place. The best proof of this effect being caused by mental vibration is found in the fact that two towns only a few miles from each other, each having the same atmospheric and geographical conditions, will manifest entirely different mental atmospheres. People often ask, if it be true that the ether is filled with mentative currents, why are we not affected more than we are? The answer is that they are affected more than they imagine, but they are still affected much less than the one would suppose at first thought, for the reason that the currents conflict with each other and rob each other of their force. And then again, nature instinctively affords a safeguard and sets up additional powers of resistance. Just as nature protects the hearing sense of those who are surrounded with many and constant noises until they fail to hear anything but an unaccustomed noise, just as she operates upon the smelling sense of the chemist until he fails to notice the odors which are most apparent to the stranger entering the shop, so does she give additional unconscious resisting power to people situated within an active field of mentative induction. Bring a person from a quiet place into a bustling active city and he is apt to be swept off his feet at first with the spirit of the place. He will either be swept into its prevailing life with an almost irresistible impulse, or else he will be repelled by reasons of the inharmonious mentative currents. In either case, however, he will be intensely aware of the vibration. But the same man, after a time, will fail to be so affected. He will be better able to resist the vibrations and will manage to live with a greater peace and poise than at first, although he will, of course, alter his nature more or less in harmony with the prevailing tone of the place. He will feel the vibration less as time goes on. Some people have so developed this resisting power that they are almost immune, while others have so little power of resistance that they are swept here and there by each strong wave of mentative energy that reaches them. They are always in some field of induction and being swayed by its vibrations. This phase of mentative induction explains the phenomena of those great waves of feelings that sweep across the country, such as the emotion that followed the sinking of the Maine in the harbor of Havana, Cuba. You will remember the first shock that came to you when you read the account in the morning papers. Then there came upon you a growing sense of some impending event of great moment, mingled with a feeling of horror and indignation, followed by an almost irresistible desire to join in a movement to avenge the outrage. This latter feeling grew perceptibly as wave after wave of feeling passed over the country in mentative currents, setting up increased mental feeling by induction. Older people will remember many similar waves that swept over the land in the past days. These things are common and give you a clue to the apparent mystery of the actions of mobs composed of a number of individuals who combine in numbers and then commit acts that no one man of the lot would think of perpetrating singly or individually. The conscience of the mob is apparently a thing apart from the individual consciousness of the units composing it. After the excitement, the morning after, many, if not all, of the persons concerned felt a sickening horror and wonder at their work. A mob is a cyclonic center of mentative currents, resembling a whirlpool or whirlwind, with an active center and a less active circumference. Great waves of religious fervor noticeable during the progress of revivals are accounted for in the same way. A few active revivalists starts a whirlwind of fervid feeling and emotion, and it spreads out in constantly widening circles, increasing until a climax is reached, and then a diminishing strength is apparent, which gradually settles down into the accustomed mental state of the community. These whirlwinds or whirlpools of emotional excitement of whatever kind are of course strengthened by the constantly repeating suggestions of those participating in it, which, with the constantly growing volume of mentative energy being thrown forth, serves to add fuel to the fire. This force would go on forever, steadily gaining in strength and volume, were it not for a provision of nature which causes the law of rise and fall, increase and decrease, that universal law of rhythm, to manifest in this as in all else in her domain. Everything has its rise, its climax, and its decline. So much for these general waves of mentative energy or mentative currents, but there is another phase to be considered. Many phases, in fact. Let us examine them. First, there are the mentative currents arising from the strong centered desire of some person who, forming a strong mental image by means of visualization, creates for himself a center of desire force, which, guided by his willpower, attracts to himself all that will fit into his plan. He constitutes himself a mentative center around his visualized idea, and constantly sends out strong mentative currents charged with the strongest, most ardent desire force, guided, directed, and projected by his developed willpower. He thus sets into operation the great mental law of attraction, of which the early writers on mental science talk so much. These mentative currents, charged with desire, spread out and soon begin a rotary movement like a whirlpool, sweeping around and around, always drawing in towards its center persons and things tending to fit in with the plans of the center. The original desire in the man's mind is reproduced in kind in the minds of thousands of people by the law of mentative induction, and they all fall in with the plan, the degree of course, depending upon the degree of positivity or negativity of the receptive mind, multiplied by the degree of positivity of the mentator. The great plans of the so-called captains of industry are carried out by reason of this law. Many of these great centers of desire force, these successful men who attract to them that which they want, and those whom they need, do not realize the nature of the force that they are using, but there are constantly increasing number who do know it, and they are working it for all it's worth. Many of these steady, cool business leaders are really deeply versed in occult laws. If the true facts of the case were to creep out, there would be the greatest sensation that the country has ever known. Then there is still another phase of the matter. I allude to the cases of men who, generally consciously but sometimes unconsciously, are focusing their mentative currents directly upon some person or persons who are necessary for their plans and desires. They are filled with desire to have this person do thus and so, or do not do thus and so, as the case may be. These men, according to their degree of concentration and willpower, direct to the other person or persons strong mentative currents of desire force, and by mentative induction set up vibrations of a corresponding rate in the minds of these others, the degree of effect produced, of course, depending upon the degree of negativity of the recipient. This effect is produced in two ways, both according to the law of mentative induction. The first way is to set up corresponding desire vibrations in the mind of the other, so that it will in turn cause his will to carry out the desire. A variation of this is to direct the desire force towards the will of the other, and thus entice or charm the other's will into compliance with the desire of the sender. This will be understood if you will remember what I have just said about the resemblance of the desire pole to the feminine and the will pole to the masculine. You will see an illustration of this in every phase of mentative influence. The second way is for the will of the sender to force its way past the will of the other and boldly make love to the desire of the other and endeavor to seduce it by mere strength and persistency until it accedes to his wishes. The variation of this is seen in the case where the attacking will boldly grapple with the will of the other and by sheer superiority of power overcomes it and makes it captive and obedient. This latter is very rare except in cases of personal interview between the two persons, aided by telementation between interviews. You will notice that the phase in which the desire pole of the mentator does the work is along the lines of feminine action, the force being of a charming, fascinating, drawing, coaxing nature, and where the will is employed, the action is decidedly masculine, the attack being made boldly and with a show of strength, the subtlety of the desire attraction being absent. The giants in the art of meditative attraction combine poles in their attacks and work, and thus, in the words of Uncle Remus, "They coach em coming, they coach em going like brefox." Then again, there is the use of mentative induction in what is known as personal magnetism, which we will see in other chapters of this book. In this phase, the mentator pours forth his mentative currents either in a general way or else in a concentrated, directed manner towards the other in a personal interview. This is the secret of what is called personal magnetism, and also of that unaccountable to the uninformed manner which some people have of overpowering others by sheer strength of will. The personal magnetism phase of personal influence is the phase of feminine activity, and the force of will phase is the phase of masculine activity. Then there is that form of mentative induction called mental suggestion, which I take up in later chapters. Although suggestions has to do with words, etc., rather than with mentative currents, still the principle is the same. The mental state is induced by words or physical things which are the results of feeling and mental states, just as is the phonographic record the result of the original speech which it is able to reproduce when the diaphragm is brought into contact with the needle. And then there is very little mental suggestion that is not accomplished with mentative currents, very little indeed. In closing this lesson, I wish to caution my readers to refrain from manifesting or feeling anything like fear at what I have said about the use of mentative energy by other people. Remember, the fear in itself is the most negative influence and most weakening mental state known. It renders negative the most positive man if freely indulged in. No matter how potent may be these mentative currents, there are none that may not be rendered impotent and ineffectual by your own willpower set in motion by your own desire force. Each and every one of you have within you and under your own control a force that will render you perfectly and absolutely immune from undesirable mentative influence, no matter who may use it against you. Nature has blessed all of us in this respect. It makes no bane without its antidote, and does not depart from its role in this phase any more than in any other. It supplies the means of self-protection to everyone and always furnishes the defensive weapon to match the offensive one. As a matter of fact, you are defending yourself constantly although you may not know it. Much of this defensive work is done along the subconscious lines, but you are doing much of it consciously by the use of your will and spirit of individuality. You are using the mental no all the time, unless you are some poor creature who is afraid to say no, even mentally. And if you are that, then this book is doubly needed by you. I shall instruct every student of this book in many different ways as we proceed with the lessons in this art of self-protection. No one who studies this book needs ever again fear any undue influence on the part of others. I propose to make mental masters of you, and to teach you to throw off the bonds and shackles of mental slavery. I intend to make you strong, positive individuals, instead of weak, negative personalities. There is nothing to be afraid of except fear. So the sooner you cast off fear, the better you will be, and the more advanced on the road to mastery. While this is not the place for exercises, still I want each and every one of you to start right in now and form a mental attitude of fearlessness and strength, that you may begin at once to send forth mentative currents of that rate of vibration. If you do so, and you will, I know, then you will begin to notice an improvement at once. You will begin to realize your increasing power, and you will also see that others are beginning to feel it. Begin today, this moment, to radiate mentative currents of strength and power in all directions. Stimulate the currents by arousing a strong, intense, burning desire to be strong and to radiate strength vibrations. Then back this up by the application of a strong, steady, masterful, and dominant will, and then the trick will be done. But right here, remember, first, last, and all the time, that it is not a mere matter of thinking, but a matter of feeling. Thoughts are cold, but feelings are warm, alive, and vital. Therefore, you must not merely think I am strong or say it like a parrot, but you must stir up your nature to its depth until you can really feel that you are indeed strong and possessed of the radiant energy of mentative force. Feeling is living thought. Everything that is worthwhile was produced by this feeling thought. Feeling, desire, emotion, passion, wanting, willing, demanding. These are the things that have creative powers. So do not deceive yourself with this holding the thought or any such nonsense of which you have heard so much until you get sick at the mention of the words. It is not simply holding the thought, it is holding the desire, backing it up with the will. That does the trick. To create a thing, you must want it with a burning, eager want that brooks no denial, backed up by a will that knows no such word as can't or no. Chapter 10. Personal Magnetism. Perhaps the most interesting manifestation of mind power along the lines of telementation and mentative induction, at least to the beginner in the study of the subject, is the phase known as personal magnetism. We may as well begin by considering the use of the word magnetism in connection with mental influence. We often hear of personal magnetism, mental magnetism, magnetic personality, magnetic attraction, magnetic influence, etc. used in the sense of mental attraction, personal influence, fascination, charming, psychological influence, etc. Let us see just why the term is used. The explanation involves an interesting bit of little-known occult history. The word magnetism, of course, arises from the word magnet. Now here is an interesting bit of history. You will see in the dictionaries that the term magnet was given the lodestone or natural magnet because it was first discovered near Magnesia, a town in Asia Minor. This explanation is most amusing to those familiar with the records of old occult brotherhoods, for the latter know that instead of the magnet being named after the town was named after the magnet, the latter being known centuries before the town of Magnesia was built. The natural magnet was known in China, India, and Persia thousands of years ago. Its name magnet arose from the same Persian word as magic, namely Maj, signifying the esoteric priesthood or Magians. The name was given because the power of the natural magnet resembled the mental power exerted by the Magians, and the stone was called literally the Magian stone or the magic stones. Hence the words magnet and magnetism. So you see, we come by our use of the word in a perfectly natural way. An interesting fact, and one that goes to prove that minds work in accustomed channels, is to be noted in the circumstance that the mysterious phenomena of mesmerism, etc., noticed in Europe and America during the past century or so, came to be naturally called animal magnetism, personal magnetism, etc., the mind of the public intuitively connecting the phenomena with that of the magnet, which it very much resembles. And in our day we speak of people being very magnetic, lacking magnetism, having a magnetic presence, etc. And so history repeats itself. The magnet, which was originally called the Magian or magic stone because its force resembled the mentative attraction manifested by the Magi or Magians, serves to give a name to similar manifestation of mental force centuries after. The magnet gives back to the 20th century Magians the name it borrowed from the Magians of ancient Persia. It has repaid the debt. While the phase of mind power, which has to do with the operation of the force upon distant minds and objects, is perhaps the most startling, still that phase which is called personal magnetism is one of the most important and remarkable. Its very frequent occurrence often causes us to overlook it, but it is the phase which is effectively used by those who understand it, and the one against which it behooves us to guard ourselves. All have noticed that some individuals seem to have a winning way about them and are able to induce others to fall into their way of thinking and to do what they wish done. The so-called magnetic man is able to sway audiences or individuals by his mystic power, and one often fails to realize just how it was done when he recalls the words spoken or reads them in cold type the morning after. The secret lies not alone in what is said or even in how it is said, but rather in how great a degree personal magnetism was emanated by the speaker. Many persons who have dealings with the public in the direction of selling goods, securing subscriptions, selling life insurance, etc., etc., have acquired a degree of the art of using personal magnetism, often being unconscious of the force they are employing. And many large employers of agents have schools wherein the agents are taught the psychology of suggestion, personal influence, etc., and more or less of personal magnetism, although under some other name. And more than this, every person who is in earnest when talking to another person manifests more or less personal magnetism, unconsciously or consciously. While the statement may bring down upon my head the wrath of those who believe that the phenomena of the old-fashioned revival are due to the workings of the spirit, I do not hesitate to affirm that all students of psychology know that the greater part of the fervor is due to emotional excitement produced by personal magnetism, manifesting along both the lines of mentative currents and suggestions. Anyone who has ever attended a Christian revival or camp meeting has carried away with him a memory of the effects of a certain kind of personal magnetism upon a certain type of emotional minds. And not alone in the field of emotional religion does this force manifest itself so strongly, it is just as plainly demonstrated in the case of emotional politics. Let any man sit down and sanely consider the performance of the average man of the rank and file of either of the political parties during a campaign. See how men are swayed by emotional appeals to their prejudices and party spirit. See how they allow themselves to be blinded by glittering promises and statements without a shred of reasonable argument until they become fanatics. The emotions are skillfully played upon by the leaders and speakers, and the current of personal magnetism and suggestion spreads over the body of the party until they become a mob possessed of certain fixed ideas that have taken possession of them. Families are split by factional differences, and hatred reigns when love formerly had its abode. The excitement grows fiercer and fiercer until at last the day of the election is at hand, and the country goes into an emotional excitement. Then the result is announced. The next day everyone suffers from a relapse, and the country begins to laugh over what has happened. After the sting of defeat has worn off, and the elation of victory has melted away, it is found that the country is moving along about as usual, not going to the dogs because some man is defeated, nor taking great leaps forward because some other man has been elected town supervisor or president, as the case may be. The people play their parts year after year, that is the majority of them, being swayed by emotional excitement rather than by reason, thought, or intelligence. And the men who pull the mental strings grin to themselves as they think over what fools these mortals be, and prepare themselves to pull the same string again upon the next occasion, and to make their sheep-like followers again dance to the tune of "My party, right or wrong, my party." And in both revival and political campaign, the moving spirit is the same. Our old friend personal magnetism operates through the force of a few feelings conveyed from the minds of the few to the minds of the many, aided and abetted in its subtle influence by its mate, mental suggestion. Getting force under the force of the desire and will of each person who adds his force to the original impulse, it swells in volume until, like the rolling snowballs, it grows to mammoth proportions and sweeps all before it. You have often heard that enthusiasm is infectious. Did you ever wonder why? Have you ever wondered why you enjoyed a theatrical performance more when the house is filled than when only half its seating capacity is used? Have you ever understood the cause of the wave of enthusiasm that has swept over the large audience, including yourself, until you felt all in a mental glow? Have you ever realized that what is known as the psychology of the crowd, by which term is meant the influence that can be gained over a crowd, whereas the separate individuals composing the crowd could not be so affected, is due to personal magnetism and mental suggestion, which is started into operation and then spread from mind to mind by the added desire and will manifested in mental states and their associated physical actions. And there is another fact to be remembered while we are considering audiences and crowds. I allude to the fact that the speaker is affected by the personal magnetism of the audience, which flows back upon him, giving him increased power to send again to them his own ideas, awakening fresh emotional excitement in them. It is action and reaction always. It is of the greatest importance that one understands the cause of these mental epidemics, for when the cause is once understood, one is far less liable to be carried away by emotional excitement spread in this way. Many sober, sensible people have been swept off their feet by these waves of personal magnetism and have done and said things that would otherwise have been impossible for them. They have allowed the personal magnetism to reach into their minds through the emotive pole, arousing ideas and desires that otherwise would have been impossible. We have seen or heard of respectable citizens, including the members of the so-called learned professions, lawyers, doctors, teachers, preachers, joining in mobs and allowing themselves to be carried away by the personal magnetism and suggestion of the more excitable members thereof, and participating in acts that afterwards seem like horrible nightmares to them. The emotional nature is always very near the surface in the majority of men, and it should be ever guarded from outside arousing influences. The motive pole of the mind, the willpower, should ever be on guard to resist this invasion of the emotive pole, desire force. And so should the will ever be on guard to neutralize the personal magnetism of others who in personal interviews seek to bend the minds of their hearers to their ideas, and by thus arousing desire, mold them so as to work their wills upon them. In all of these cases of personal magnetism and mental suggestion, whether along the lines of personal influencing, appeals, artful suggestions, etc., as well as in the cases of mental epidemic, the effect is produced by the mentator or suggester obtaining the voluntary attention of the other or others, and thus holding his will engaged and his emotive pole of mind thus unguarded, while he pours in his mentative currents or suggestions, usually both, into the emotive pole of his hearers. He thus induces in them the desire, emotions, and feelings which act as motive forces, causing them to act according to his wishes and will. The person affected is rendered unable to reason correctly or intelligently, for his will is on a vacation, and his reason is swayed by his desires, emotions, and feelings, thus induced, the necessary support of the will being lacking. The will of the man sending the mentative currents or mental suggestion is in control instead of the wills of the hearers and persons influenced. In the cases of widespread mental contagion, the influence spread from mind to mind along the same lines and according to the same laws. I trust that what I have said along these lines will appeal to the student in the direction of causing him to interpose a resistance to these currents and suggestions in cases such as I have mentioned. The remedy is in his own hands, simply the interposition of the will, in the manner of which I shall speak as we proceed. Surround yourself with an armor of willpower, which will act as a shield against influences of this sort, and which will beat them back. It is apparent to all students of human nature that there is a wonderful difference in the degree of what is called personal force, observable in different persons with whom we come in contact. Some are very forceful and others are quite forceless, and others form varying degrees between these two extremes. This difference in personal force depends upon the degree of dynamic positivity or negativity in the magnetism of each person. The man who is able to manifest a strong degree of mind power along the lines of motive polarity or willpower becomes dynamically positive. I use the word positive in this connection in the sense of Webster's definition, having the power to direct action or influence. Passing down the scale through varying and lessening degrees of positivity, we reach the case of the man who is almost devoid of this power, of manifesting mind power, and his condition we call that of dynamic negativity. By negative, as I use it here, I mean non-positive, lacking the power of direct action or influence. Now, every person has his own degree of dynamic positivity. Each one is dynamically positive to some others and dynamically negative to others still. Unless indeed one has reached the limit of positivity or negativity, when two people meet, there normally ensues a silent, quiet struggle between the dynamic mentation, depending for its intensity upon the importance of the meeting. Still, in any and all events, the struggle ensues, usually unconsciously. It may be over in a moment, or it may last a long time. But from that struggle, sooner or later, one or the other must emerge a victor, unless, as is rarely the case, they are of equal degrees of positivity, and there is no mistake about the result. Each one recognizes himself as the victor or the defeated and adjusts himself to his relative position. I do not mean by this that the degree of dynamic positivity is fixed permanently in either person, for the contrary is the case. One of the persons who is really stronger usually may be weaker at that particular time, owing to his will being fatigued or by reason of his having relaxed his willpower, as is often the case. And in such a case, the defeated one may be the victor at the next encounter, or may even rally his energies in a moment later and turn the tables. One may have a strong will in a moments of activity, and yet in moments of passivity he may relax it very much. And a still more important fact, one may so increase his willpower that he will be able to completely dominate those who formerly overmastered and even overawed him. All of us know of instances of this kind in our own personal experiences. At the extreme dynamic positive pole are to be found those wonderfully forceful men who seem to dominate all with whom they come in contact. These people fairly paralyze the wills of those around them and induce emotive states almost at will. When in deep, earnest, mentative effort, they seem to actually plunge their will into the mind of the other persons and set themselves up as the dominant force therein, taking the others' wills captive and holding them obedient to the master will of the positive men. Such men are of course rare, and whenever they exist they make a strong mark on the history of their times, local or general. I do not like to quote Napoleon Bonaparte as an example, for he has been used to illustrate almost everything, but still the mind intuitively flies to him in thinking of the dominant will. Napoleon had a marvelous will, an almost superhuman will. It was manifested not only on the world at large, but also upon those closest to him in the way of personal contact. This man worked his will on those around him and forced his desires upon them also. He dominated everything and everybody, and his contemporaries, even his enemies, testify to this marvelous personal power. He is a very good example of this extreme positive type. Passing down the scale, we see men of strong personal force in all walks of life. These men formerly played the part of warriors or rulers of kingdoms, but the increasing importance of commercial life in the world's affairs has developed and brought forth a new type of these positive men who now show themselves as captains of industry, prominent figures in frenzied finance, makers and rulers of the great trusts of this country and others. A little lower in the scale of personal force we find men of marked power, but still a little less strong than those above them. And so we pass down through the varying degrees of the scale, meeting the average man and woman, and then on to the weaklings of the race. At the extreme negative end of the scale, we find those impressionable creatures known to students of experimental psychology as somnambules or impressionables, who have merely to be told to do a thing in an authoritative manner in order to have them attempt to do it, or at least to feel impelled to do so. There are many people upon whom the phenomena of extreme mental suggestion may be produced while they are wide awake. They will feel the burn on their hands caused by your finger if you but suggest it to them in the right way. They will be unable to draw apart their hands, which have been fastened together by your strong suggestion. They will be drawn backward or forward by your suggestion. There are many people of this kind, some more impressionable than others, but all quite impressionable, who will be driven this way or that way by those who understand the subject. Fortunately, this fact is not generally recognized, or else we should hear of still more cases of strange influence, etc. in the newspapers. But the subject is becoming more widely discussed and known now, and it is only a question of time when the law will be compelled to recognize it. Fortunately, however, the extreme negative condition may be overcome by one by developing his will and learning the principles underlying the subject. Knowledge of the nature of this subject robs the force of much of its effect, the latter depending largely upon the passive ignorance of the subject. Give him the proper instruction and he will be able to interpose a resistance. Every man has his present place on the scale, but he may improve his position. Personal magnetism bears a close resemblance to that which in olden times was frequently called mental fascination. Fascination means the act of fascinating or state of being fascinated. The word fascinate springs from the Latin word fascinare, meaning to enchant, bewitch, charm by eyes or tongue, captivate, attract, etc. The definition of the English word fascinate is as follows: to act upon by some power or irresistible influence, to influence by an irresistible charm, to allure, to charm, captivate, or attract powerfully, to influence the imagination, reason, or will of another in an uncontrollable manner, to enchant, captivate, or allure powerfully or irresistibly. The above definition is condensed from a number of best dictionaries and gives the essence of the idea embodied in the word. In this work I use the term personal magnetism in the sense of the action of mind power in the direction of powerfully influencing the imagination, desire, or will of another. This is my own broad definition, which includes all the varied phenomena. And that brings the end to the three chapter 8, 9, and 10. If you haven't already, please subscribe below to be informed of the next video. Thank you for your time.